In recent years, official offices have acknowledged a sharp rise in UAP reports, while congressional hearings brought forward whistleblower claims of recovered materials and even non-human biologics. But the public record on crash recoveries remains incomplete, leaving only faint traces of what might actually happen at those sites. Some insiders, including Emory Smith, say they encountered living non-human beings during retrievals, forcing their teams into choices far beyond cataloging wreckage. What protocols exist when you come face to face with an alien that is still alive? The numbers released publicly only deepen the silence around that question. The 2025 numbers no one expected. The year 2025 arrived with an unexpected development: the release of new data confirming a surge in UAP reports through official channels. The Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, publicly acknowledged receiving hundreds of new cases, with more than 700 logged between mid-2023 and mid-2024 alone. These numbers, though framed as unexplained aerial incidents rather than crash recoveries, mark the sharpest increase ever placed in the public record. Just as these reports circulated, hearings in Washington pushed the conversation further when whistleblowers testified under oath about secret programs involving downed craft and what they described as non-human biologics. It was a striking collision of public numbers, sworn allegations, and continuing denials from defense officials who insist no extraterrestrial materials are held. Taken together, these elements form a tense picture. On one hand, government offices openly document sightings and encounters in increasing volume. On the other, whistleblowers suggest that what crashes to Earth has consequences beyond twisted alloys and scorched equipment. David Grush, a former intelligence officer, told Congress that recovery efforts extended to biological evidence, an allegation the Pentagon firmly denied. Yet the very act of denial kept the story alive, pushing researchers and journalists to ask how protocols might be written to handle the possible discovery of something alive. When isolated references to biological recovery appeared in testimony and were followed by redactions in related documents, the speculation only deepened. Were these omissions shielding routine military practices, or were they concealing evidence of life found intact at crash sites? Public filings never use the word survivor. Official vocabulary remains locked within terms such as materials, objects, or incidents, carefully avoiding language that would imply intelligence or presence beyond technology. That avoidance stands out most once contrasted with insider testimony, which provides sharp details precisely where official writings turn vague. So if official files avoid the word survivor, what do insiders say actually happened on the ground? Emory Smith, for example, has long described experiences that bridge this gap. His recollections refer not only to recovered machinery but to encounters with beings, injured, moving, even struggling. In his telling, biological recovery was not theory but reality. Placing his words against the backdrop of rising UAP statistics and congressional testimony changes their weight. They no longer exist as isolated claims. They fill the silence left by documents that list operations but refuse to define outcomes. Smith is not a politician, not a lobbyist. He is among the few who maintains that he stood in those zones where the mechanical and biological collided. The contrast between public admissions and withheld details raises larger questions about process. If the government has acknowledged hundreds of incidents in 1 year, is it reasonable to imagine some of those involved debris striking the Earth? If debris exists, then logically the possibility of surviving occupants exists as well. Yet the paperwork stops short at every turn, building a barricade of denial around that one scenario. The decision to create a barrier at the word biological makes it seem less like a classification issue and more like the deliberate shaping of narrative boundaries. This is why each redaction carries disproportionate weight. The pattern suggests that the story at risk of emerging is not about machines alone. At the global level, the implications are even greater. Tracking organizations that log civilian reports have documented sightings spanning continents, and military alliances often coordinate their data within closed networks. The idea that multiple countries run parallel recovery efforts hints at agreements designed to keep secrets distributed and less vulnerable to leaks. Shared silence appears strategic. No single state can be faulted for concealment if the silence stretches across borders. That coordination itself becomes evidence of deeper organization and of events sophisticated enough to require it. If acknowledged statistics show rising incidents, Alleged testimony describes biologics, and redactions obscure key terms. Then a pattern emerges, not of disclosure, but of controlled exposure. Numbers rise in public view, yet entire categories of information remain excluded. This imbalance keeps public attention focused and leaves researchers to infer missing dimensions. Every official denial invites comparison to insider claims. Every public figure gesturing at materials makes private references to survivors more striking. Because once the public knows hundreds of incidents exist, the absence of detailed descriptions becomes louder than any statement offered. The 2025 shift, then, may not be about a single figure or report. Its significance lies in how separate threads converged. Formal offices publishing larger datasets, whistleblowers introducing the specter of biological recovery, and governments editing or rejecting those same allegations in official responses. Each part is clear enough, but together they form a mosaic that seems to outline an unspoken truth lurking just beyond what has been published. In that mixture, the human element, witnesses who insist they saw life at crash sites, takes on sharper relevance. Where the written record steps back, these accounts step forward. And this is what keeps the atmosphere charged. If only material recoveries were underway, the silence would be easier to justify. But the combination of specific terms, careful omissions, and pointed testimony creates a friction that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Smith's voice, in particular, intersects perfectly with the one forbidden phrase appearing in public sources. At the exact point where officials draw a line, his testimony begins. It is not evidence in the forensic sense, but it lands in the empty space left open by institutions and fits too closely to ignore. By late 2025, the question is no longer whether retrievals occur. Numbers from ARO confirm that anomalous encounters are being documented at a faster rate than ever. The real question is what structures stand in the shadows around these retrievals. Who arrives first when a crash site is quarantined? What rules determine when to treat an injured being like a patient rather than an artifact? And most of all, how do governments keep such volatile operations hidden while acknowledging just enough to appear transparent? The testimony of participants like Smith suggests that biological recovery was not a footnote written suddenly in 2025. It was a reality long before, now brushing up against official language despite every attempt to hold it back. These testimonies do not answer every question, but they point toward procedures most of the public cannot yet see. And once the idea takes hold that teams may have confronted something alive, the focus naturally shifts away from abstract statistics and into the heart of operational detail. Understanding how these missions unfold requires examining a very different side of government response. Numbers tell us that incidents occur. Testimony tells us that living beings may be present. But the hidden order behind these recoveries, the precise way human teams are deployed into environments that might still be active, is far more revealing. Only by considering that chain of response can we start to understand what insiders claim they witnessed when technology and biology collided at the edge of secrecy. The hidden order of crash retrieval teams. When insiders describe what happens after an unidentified craft comes down, they often emphasize one thing above all: order. An entire sequence unfolds, not improvised but repeated according to a hidden structure known only to those directly involved. The hidden order of crash retrieval teams refers to this chain of actions: who moves first, how zones are sealed when specialists approach, and what rules decide if a scene is safe enough to enter. Everything begins from the understanding that a crash site is not neutral ground, but a place carrying hazards nobody fully understands. The first wave belongs to military units. Their job is not analysis, and they are not there to inspect wreckage. They create a perimeter, close off airspace, and prevent uncontrolled entry. Insiders like Emory Smith have described seeing military teams move in almost immediately after an incident, sometimes within half an hour, with locals cut off before they grasp the scale of what happened. Other sources, including testimony reported by outlets like News Nation, also speak of rapid lockdowns and tightly managed access. The point is speed, to secure the ground before debris or anything inside the craft is exposed to bystanders. Once secured, the site shifts into the hands of more specialized personnel. These retrieval teams are not conventional medical or scientific staff, but operators trained for environments where unknown materials and possible non-human biology might still be active. The procedure is deliberate. Medics sweep the outer zones first, checking for atmospheric contamination or biological hazards. Only after that come engineers and materials specialists, who prepare to examine wreckage or stabilize equipment. Each step is methodical, designed to protect both the team and whatever might be inside the craft. Safety depends most on scanning the environment before anyone advances into the heart of the crash area. According to insiders, this involves drones capable of mapping radiation levels across wide distances, technology far beyond a handheld counter. Teams also measure gravitational fluctuations, since multiple witnesses describe local distortions at crash sites. Everything from equipment malfunctions to visible disorientation of animals. Such tools are described in testimony as standard practice, because rushing in without them risks injury before a rescuer even touches the wreckage. To manage this process, some reports mention advanced sensor fusion systems that combine data to mark the safest routes forward. Whether AI is formally involved is not known, but insiders consistently stress that mapping invisible hazards is the precondition for entry. The discipline is strict. No one pushes into a contaminated zone until overlapping scans confirm safe paths. It is patience that keeps teams alive. Accounts speak of personnel collapsing after unknowingly stepping outside cleared areas, their bodies reacting to unseen fields. This is why, as multiple insiders explain, crash zones are always treated as hostile until proven otherwise. Unknown radiation, magnetic surges, and energetic emissions can strike without warning. Edward Barber, a Navy witness, has linked prolonged exposure to debilitating illness, underscoring how real the risks can be. To the untrained eye, a crash site might seem inert or harmless, but specialists regard it as a live hazard by default. Those who have been near these zones often recall strange physical cues that accompany the technical data. Emory Smith has described moments where the air itself seemed to hum, resonating through his bones before the wreckage came into view. Such a vibration is not dismissed by trained teams. It is taken as a warning that power systems may remain active. These moments change the atmosphere of a mission from technical procedure to personal survival. Every step deeper into the site is weighed against the possibility of collapse, injury, or worse. Compared with conventional disaster response, recovery operations take place under conditions no firefighter or medic would face in ordinary training. Entering a burning building or quarantine zone involves known risks. At crash retrievals, physical law itself can feel uncertain. Radios cut out, compasses spin, or heavy equipment behaves unpredictably. This is why procedures include not just biological triage but environmental triage. The landscape itself must be stabilized before a vehicle or body can be moved. Once scans declare an area navigable, the focus shifts from containment to recovery. Medics enter again, not just for human safety, but because of the possibility that something alive could be inside. At this moment, engineers and materials experts follow close behind. Their task is to stabilize machinery, gather fragments safely, and preserve any devices without interrupting unknown systems still operating. The sequence balances urgency with restraint. Acting too slowly could mean the loss of life inside. Acting too quickly could ignite a hazard that takes human lives. The order exists to weigh those pressures against each other. All of this unfolds under a shield of secrecy. Insiders agree that by the time civilians notice commotion near an incident, official barricades often dominate the area. Roads close, communications falter, skies over the zone restrict immediately. Explanations follow, claims of routine drills, downed aircraft, or natural events. Behind these explanations, teams have already begun, relying on strict disciplines learned from previous recoveries. Multiple accounts make clear that the public rarely glimpses any of this in real time. Inside the teams, survival guides everything. Crews step carefully not for curiosity, but for self-preservation. The professional detachment expected of scientists does not erase the physical reminders of vulnerability. Bodies trembling under invisible fields, equipment distorted by interference, lungs tightening without cause. These reminders force even veterans to remember the stakes. Survival for the team comes first, but survival for any unknown life inside cannot be ignored. The order that governs retrievals, then, is not only about hardware or secrecy, but about a balance between control and compassion. Soldiers quarantine the site. Scanning crews map the unseen environment. Medics test the air and prepare for trauma response. Engineers take apart machinery without disrupting hidden systems. Each step builds toward the possibility that inside the wreck lies not only strange metals or devices, but something else. Insiders stress that this possibility cannot ever be excluded, which is why the pace of every action is controlled and exact. What waits beyond the barriers is not always clear. Sometimes wreckage is inert, yielding only alloys and fragments. Sometimes entire machines stay active, emitting signals or humming faintly across the ground. And according to testimony from witnesses like Smith, there have been occasions when recovery did not stop at machinery. Beyond the scans and the perimeters, teams have sometimes found forms inside, neither fully destroyed nor silent. At that point, protocols shift from metal to biology. The chain of response that so far has protected people and contained energy now faces another challenge. What to do if the unknown is still alive? Specialists trained for contamination control and anatomical analysis must step into situations no guidebook fully explains. The hidden order prepares them for hazards, but it cannot remove the human weight of confronting something living within a crash. It is at this stage where everything changes. Procedures that seem mechanical, barriers, scanners, time checks, give way to decisions that touch on empathy, survival, and responsibility. The hidden structure of security and recovery only carries a team so far. When something moves, when an eye opens or a body stirs, another order must take over. The rules written for contact with life. And that is where the testimonies suggest the true test begins. When the extraterrestrial was still alive. According to Emory Smith, there came a day when what looked like ordinary wreckage revealed something no one had prepared for. His team expected fragments of twisted alloy and perhaps lifeless remains. Instead, as they moved closer, Smith claims they saw a hand shift, small, deliberate, undeniable. What they had assumed were still remains showed signs of breathing. In that moment, training faltered. The group had scanned for heat signatures, they had monitored for motion, but they had been preparing only for remains. Seeing movement reframed the entire mission. Teams at these sites are drilled in handling perimeters, in stabilizing artifacts, in containing potential hazards. However, insiders acknowledge there are few public, standardized manuals for responding to a living being. Fragments of policy exist, sometimes referred to in testimony as biological recovery protocols. Yet much of the work in the field depends on judgment and improvisation. That gap forces recovery crews into high-stakes, ad hoc choices. Smith recalls that when his team realized the being before them was alive, no checklist felt adequate. Even documents released in 2025 complicate the picture. They include the recurring phrase, biological evidence, an expression that appears in redacted files and has been raised in public hearings by whistleblowers. The wording is vague. It might mean tissue, it might mean a full body. It could even cover the survival of an intact life form. For personnel on site, the ambiguity is not theoretical. To them, biological evidence becomes an implicit acknowledgement of encounters they experienced directly. At the center of such moments are decisions with no easy answers. Intervene, and the attempt to stabilize the entity may kill it outright. Do nothing, and survival chances diminish with every passing minute. Move the body, and whatever supports its life, even a field sustained by the wreck itself, could destabilize. These three options form the wall that teams run into. No matter what choice is made, risk cannot be avoided. Medical training offers some insight, but limited certainty. Anatomy lessons cover comparative physiology and hypothetical variations, yet standing a few feet away from something alive highlights how inadequate that theory feels. Smith described the being his team saw as both fragile and resilient, features that resisted easy classification. Was that muscular tissue or something else? Did circulation resemble blood flow, or an entirely different system? The uncertainty immobilized otherwise decisive professionals. Even the shape of breathing raised questions. How much air, if any, sustained it, and whether its chest movement could be interpreted as distress. In the tension that followed, professional roles began to conflict. Scientists leaned toward distance and observation. Medics wanted to take immediate action to reduce suffering. Soldiers worried about security risks if the being remained aware enough to resist. All three instincts clashed in silence inside the helmets of the team. Beneath every professional impulse lay the simplest response, empathy. It is not written into standard operating manuals. It is not part of technical training. But when eyes flicker open or fingers shift again, empathy asserts itself as a powerful force pushing against command hierarchy. These involuntary human reactions rewrite the atmosphere of the mission. If Smith's account is accurate, that first live encounter demonstrated limits no document had ever prepared them for. Recovery operations had always been framed as technical: secure, scan, recover. But once a being struggled to breathe at their feet, the operation became a moral test. Machinery can be photographed, debris catalogued. Life demands more. That distinction changes everything, because a decision made in those seconds cannot be erased. The presence of a conscious being also triggers a new line of worry: communication. If the noises heard were not only respiration but possibly language, then any movement, a glance, a gesture, might hold meaning. Suddenly the act of standing near the entity, without responding, becomes a form of interaction. What counts as contact? What happens if the being expected acknowledgement? The ambiguity forces teams to consider that first contact may already have commenced without anyone meaning for it to. The unanswered question is how official doctrine handles such moments. Government paperwork outlines retrieval procedures, quarantines, and scans for contamination. Little to nothing addresses what happens when survivors are pulled from inside wreckage. Did existing biological recovery guidelines demand restraint, treatment, or containment? To Smith's knowledge, the choice landed with those on the ground in real time. That absence of clear instruction left even well-organized teams operating in ethical gray zones. From outside, recovery efforts may look efficient: blackout helicopters, sealed off roads, quick transport of debris. But Smith's account emphasizes how radically operations shift the moment life is confirmed. The goals invert. Where once it was about securing evidence, it becomes about maintaining survival and dignity. Choices harder to calculate under secrecy. Witnesses report that the strain of balancing human empathy against the risks of contamination is what stays with them long after deployments. For Smith and others who have spoken anonymously, the memory that lingers is not the shape of the craft or the design of unfamiliar alloy. It is that confrontation with another breathing presence. Some wanted to observe, others to stabilize, still others to guard against potential threat. Caught among these tensions, the sense of shared humanity grew stronger, not weaker. The foreignness of the situation made compassion feel more urgent. This is why many insiders suggest that current discussions about disclosure miss the point. Public debate often revolves around numbers of sightings or categories of recovered craft. But the heart of the issue lies in those few occasions when something lived. Statistics do not convey what it means to watch an unfamiliar chest rise and fall. For the individuals present, that reality defies being reduced to a redacted reference like biological evidence. It is not abstract, it is lived memory sealed inside classified missions. The wedge these events drive into official narratives is significant. If insiders are correct, then recovery was never limited to metals and devices. It was also about survival, compassion, and the uncertainty of acting without precedent. That memory cannot be erased by terminology. Each witness understands the stakes in ways that reach beyond chain of command. Accounts like Smith's underline one more truth. Once life is confirmed, the incident is no longer passive. It requires action. Whether medical, security-driven, or empathetic, doing nothing is itself a choice. That realization is what transforms recovery into first contact. In seconds, the ordinary hierarchy of decisions gives way to a more profound test of judgment. That hinge, where evidence becomes experience and secrecy collides with survival, is the point upon which these stories turn. It explains why teams in the field sometimes operate beyond written instructions. According to insiders, those moments demand responses that no manual can fully dictate. And it is in those choices, whether guided by science, command, or compassion, that the future of such encounters begins to take shape. Which raises one last question. When a recovery team understands that the form before them is alive, what rules are supposed to guide their next move? That moment does not stretch across hours. Insiders stress it collapses into seconds. The next section examines how certain protocols, official and improvised, attempt to answer that impossible demand. Protocols for first contact under siege conditions. Protocols for first contact under siege conditions were shaped not in theory, but in the heat of those moments when crews realized they were standing over something still alive. According to insiders, these procedures attempt to balance medical instinct, military caution, and the recognition that secrecy surrounds every action. The basic framework has been described as a layered approach, though each layer quickly blurs when applied in the field. At their simplest, the steps look like this. 1. Stabilization of the subject, if possible. 2. Observation for signs of awareness or intentional movement. 3. Remote monitoring to gather data without interference. Even these stripped-down stages strain under pressure. The first, stabilization, appears simple when written on paper, but has proven to be the most dangerous in practice. Standard human medicine assumes shared biology, but crash retrieval often makes that assumption unsafe. Insiders, including Emory Smith, warn repeatedly about the risks of trying to apply basic oxygen, chest compressions, or other familiar treatments. Leaked guidelines cited in interviews and testimony echo this, noting that medics are instructed to avoid human-only interventions unless specifically cleared. One insider recalled a case in which applying oxygen appeared to worsen a being's condition, suggesting that human medical instinct sometimes accelerates decline rather than preventing it. Smith himself has described anatomy unlike human structure, where even minor contact could interrupt critical functions. That is why many training accounts frame the first directive not as help immediately, but as pause until more is known. The second stage, recognition of awareness, overlaps tightly with stabilization because signs of life are rarely straightforward. Many teams focus on subtle cues, the rhythm of eye movement, repetitive gestures, or patterns in skin tone shifts. Pauses are deliberately spaced before re-entering the subject's field, giving room to see whether responses repeat or change. These moments of stillness are not hesitation, they are measurement. The aim is to determine if motion is reflexive or intentional. Some sources, such as accounts linked to anomalous research programs, suggest that trained personnel tested for impressions that felt telepathic in nature, though these efforts are described as quiet, limited, and not definitive. What mattered most was whether the subject showed signs of awareness that allowed further action to be taken with restraint rather than assumption. The third tier, remote monitoring, is where technology plays its broadest role. Portable scanners capable of capturing heat gradients, electromagnetic pulses, or bioelectric patterns are carried into the field. While they generate data at a safe distance, the readings often appear erratic. Analysts reported seeing signals far beyond normal human ranges, fluctuating irregularly and resisting comparison to known biology. Instead of stable heart pulses, they recorded jagged spikes. Instead of predictable temperature or respiration, the data swayed wildly. These irregularities became proof less of one specific condition and more of why restraint mattered above intervention. Collect first, act later, because acting without context could end the subject's life. Yet the protocols rarely unfold in clean order because of another complication: craft technology that continues operating after a crash. According to testimonies, some machines appear to emit environmental fields that act as life support systems, keeping occupants alive even when damaged. Removing a being from such a zone risks severing the very support sustaining it. This creates a cruel tension. Leave it in place, and it may die if the structure collapses. Take it out, and it may die instantly from the loss of field stabilization. Engineers argue that disturbing active systems could trigger unknown reactions. Medics push to intervene before deterioration becomes irreversible. Commanders, however, often fall back on containment priorities, arguing for the need to secure evidence before risking full contact. In these conflicting instincts, seconds matter, and insiders describe moments where hesitation or disagreement decided outcomes. One account, attributed to an unnamed recovery officer, told of an attempt to force stabilization with human gear. The procedure, simple and routine for ordinary trauma, appeared catastrophic for the being. Later reflection suggested that its form might have drawn sustenance not from oxygen, but from energy transferred through unique membranes. By interfering, the team inadvertently hastened its decline. This story circulated quietly, underscoring to new recruits that familiar instincts cannot be applied by reflex, no matter how strong the urge to help might feel. Still, recovery accounts emphasize that not all responses are purely technical. Several insiders, including Smith and testimony covered in reporting by outlets like News Nation, have pointed to the importance of a calm presence in the field. Witnesses said entities sometimes reacted physically to the emotional state of those around them. Stress caused irregularities to spike. Composure appeared to stabilize conditions. Some classified programs reportedly studied this effect under the label of consciousness-assisted or psionics-based interaction. The implication was not that empathy alone saved lives, but that managing emotional states had practical consequences. Rather than framed as universal mindful presence policy, insiders say crews were trained to regulate fear and project calm focus, because distress escalated instability in both being and environment. Reports circulated where teams standing quietly in composed silence saw measurable drops in stress markers compared to chaotic interventions. This was not classified as spirituality or belief, it was operational pragmatism. Maintaining composure became not only professional courtesy, but part of survival protocol. The observation aligned with broader admissions about experimental interest in human consciousness interacting with anomalous technology. Consciousness was treated not as philosophy, but as a variable in the field. Through fieldwork, a broader picture developed. First contact was not solely biological. It was relational. The quality of human presence reshaped outcomes as directly as mechanical instruments. Calm intent kept signals steady. Agitation disrupted them. Over time, insiders say these differences influenced working manuals, though in phrasing designed to avoid public pressure, language about maintaining stability, or minimizing stress exposure. The underlying point remained clear. Teams had to monitor themselves as much as the entity in front of them. Every layer of this process shows how conflicted the environment becomes. Medical instinct urges one response, military hierarchy another, and the unspoken weight of empathy presses in from a third. Overlay on all this the secrecy surrounding crash retrievals, and teams operate under conditions with no easy exits. To act decisively is risky. To hesitate is equally dangerous. And the presence of machinery integrated so tightly with biology often ensures that every choice comes at a cost. From these accounts, one lesson surfaces repeatedly. Crash retrieval is not treatment in hospital conditions, it is survival under siege. Human teams contend with biological uncertainty, possible communication attempts, and environments that react back to thought and emotion. The combination is why procedures written after each incident are intentionally cautious, leaving gaps to allow judgment calls rather than forcing one rigid model. This framing explains why first contact inside crash zones remains so deeply contested. Insiders tell of life preserved, life lost, and choices they still question. What struck them most was not the protocols themselves, but the limits of what those protocols could control. Stabilization, observation, and monitoring offer structure, but the reality at the center is unpredictable. The presence of machines capable of sustaining life or responding to mental states pushes science past conventional medicine. At each incident, the human team found itself pressed against not one, but two enigmas, a living subject and a surrounding system of technology that did not operate passively. And that raises the deeper problem still unsolved. If calm presence can stabilize an injured form, what happens when the same emotional or cognitive state activates the wreckage itself? This is the question whispered by those who witnessed craft systems pulse in sync with their own awareness, hinting that survival in these moments depended not only on saving life, but on navigating machines that reacted as if they were alive too. But what happens when the machine itself responds to thought? When the crash site is not just a pile of parts, but a mind-responsive system? Consciousness-activated craft, machines that know you. Multiple insiders, including Emory Smith and Corey Good, have claimed that some craft are not machines in the conventional sense at all. They describe devices that appeared to acknowledge the presence of humans, sometimes even reacting to their emotions or mental focus. In these accounts, the wreckage did not just sit lifeless, it seemed to register intent. For operatives used to mechanical triggers like switches or panels, encountering a structure that changed in response to a person's inner state was disorienting and potentially hazardous. This idea has been framed by witnesses as consciousness-assisted technology. Instead of levers and buttons, the craft appeared to operate through resonance between pilot and machine, as if thought itself was the control system. According to Smith, certain interiors lit up when approached calmly, but darkened again when unease rippled through the group. In contrast, Navy veteran Edward Barber described experiences he associated with psionics, a term used in his accounts to describe craft or devices that responded to mental focus in ways that could not be explained through standard engineering. While accounts differ in detail, they share a consistent suggestion. Human consciousness had tangible effects on the systems encountered. Insiders recount direct experiences that have circulated across multiple testimonies. In one of Smith's stories, he described entering a damaged craft where the walls brightened faintly as his team approached with controlled composure. When tension spread among the group, the glow faded almost instantly. It was not just illumination, it seemed to mirror their emotional state. Barber's comments add weight from a different angle. He spoke of technology that he believed recognized the operator's awareness directly, functioning only when mental effort was applied. Together, these accounts illustrate why crews often reported that their psychological discipline mattered as much as their physical safety gear. No conventional engineering model easily explains insider claims like these. Teams who worked in retrieval settings repeatedly said that when they tried mechanical activation, force, electricity, or manual pressure, the devices stayed inert. When approached mentally, some responded. Researchers examining recovered materials have hypothesized about field/consciousness interactions, though these ideas remain speculative and unverified in peer-reviewed science. Mainstream agencies such as the Pentagon or NASA have not confirmed the existence of consciousness-activated devices, nor acknowledged them as operational technology. What survives in the public record are personal testimonies from whistleblowers and a handful of references during congressional hearings about consciousness-assisted research. The claims stand at the edge of credibility, compelling because of their consistency across sources, but unsupported by formal validation. For retrieval teams, however, reports suggest the hazard felt real. One insider described a fractured console that emitted a pulse when approached during a moment of panic, an event that struck nearby personnel with a soundless wave. Witnesses said injuries included bruises and concussions from being thrown against bulkheads. Whether this was coincidence or direct reaction to emotional state is unknown. But within classified circles, it is said, such incidents were repeated enough to be treated seriously. The possibility that a human's unsteady thought could disable a life support function or trigger a defense mechanism forced teams to behave with extreme restraint. Practical implications followed. Accounts suggest that crash retrieval personnel were given warnings against relying on instinctive medical responses. Medics were told, according to Smith, that attempting human treatments like standard oxygen or chest compressions, without understanding the biology or its relationship to craft systems could backfire. That same logic extended to the craft itself. Rushing in with aggressive energy could provoke responses. Technicians reportedly began incorporating forms of mindfulness training, not as a philosophical exercise, but as an operational precaution. Insider reports indicate that composure exercises, stabilizing breath work, and stress regulation became part of preparation, because the machines were said to function better in the presence of calm discipline. A soldier jittery from fear could become more dangerous than any unseen hazard. The crucial point here is balance. These alleged systems did not appear to distinguish between a deliberate attack and an intrusive surge of anxiety. To them, both registered as disruption. On the other hand, quiet focus was sometimes rewarded with increased stability, surfaces brightening, or structures shifting into more accessible forms. Whether this was interpretation, projection, or a genuine effect remains unsolved. But insiders were convinced their experiences were more than coincidence. Machines acted differently around disparate states of mind, and survival was tied to understanding that distinction. The scale of integration in some reported crashes goes even further. Smith and others have suggested that the entire interior of a craft, floors, walls, consoles, could be unified within one system, each surface responding to attention in some way. That means no element of wreckage was neutral. A step, a glance, even a stray thought could become part of the interaction. Recovery personnel described the sensation of working inside a vessel that felt more like an organism than an object. In effect, the machines were treated as semi-aware counterparts. One did not simply dismantle panels, one engaged them. This perspective is deeply controversial. To skeptics, these claims resemble more myth than science, stories exaggerated from fragments of truth. To those who stood inside, they were lived experience, echoing from multiple testimonies across years. The absence of peer-reviewed explanation has not silenced the accounts, only sharpened the divide between what is public and what is alleged. The notion of a conscious machine is not recognized in everyday engineering, but it remains a recurrent theme in whistleblower accounts, forming one of the most challenging elements to evaluate. The psychological toll cannot be overstated. Some insiders suggest that operating within these environments required as much discipline of inner state as it did technical expertise. Personnel reported being rotated out of zones if their stress levels were too high. Others claimed they felt a mirroring effect, as though the vessel reflected their own anxiety back to them, amplifying it until they could no longer function safely. Whether psychosomatic or not, The impression was strong enough that serious guidelines were reportedly drafted to mitigate it. Again, this points not toward confirmed science, but toward operational culture within classified programs. Where does this leave the question of consciousness-activated craft in 2025? Officially, it leaves it unacknowledged. Government releases mention anomalous materials, biological evidence, and even technologies of unknown origin, but they do not describe devices that turn on through intent or emotion. Yet people like Smith, Barber, and Good insist such mechanisms are real and central to the recovery problem. Between what is written and what is testified stands a wide gap, one filled by speculation, witness accounts, and the growing pattern of stories that refuse to disappear. For those intrigued by these reports, one caution must remain clear. Mainstream institutions have never validated the claim that craft operate through consciousness. What we have are insider testimonies, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contested, woven into a body of stories about machines that foil ordinary explanation. Treating them as evidence requires recognizing them as alleged experiences, not verified record. Their value rests in patterns and consistency, not in official endorsement. Even within that caution, however, the implications insiders raised are difficult to ignore. If operation depends on intent and balance, then retrieval is not just technical but mental. Training for safety would require not only shielding, radiation measures, and scanning, but also emotional self-regulation. In other words, preparedness would need to extend into the mind. That is what insiders stress most. Without composure, nothing works. Without steady intent, the machine resists. This introduces a final complication tied to future recovery challenges. If systems reportedly linked to consciousness can already overwhelm trained personnel, what happens when the craft itself is unstable? Insiders claim that some vehicles did not remain fixed in ordinary material form at all, flickering as though stretched between conditions beyond our known physics. In those instances, recovery crews were said to face more than reactive machinery. They confronted structures that did not remain bound to one state of reality. The transition from machines responsive to thought into machines unstable within matter sets the stage for a much harder problem: retrieving technology that may not even stay present long enough to handle. Insiders speak of structures phasing in and out, fields warping space nearby, and materials slipping away when touched. Reports point to environments where a mistake could mean not only failed recovery, but lost personnel. This deeper layer of retrieval, where presence itself becomes fragile, marks the next progression in the story. Interdimensional craft and their fragile state. Some insiders say the greatest challenge comes when a craft refuses to remain stable in our physical reality at all. These are the cases often described as interdimensional, where what appears at first to be damaged wreckage instead blurs as though caught between two states, visible in one instant, translucent in the next. Testimony from witnesses like Emory Smith, Ross Coulthart's reporting, and others suggest that certain retrieval teams have faced objects that seem to phase in and out, leaving operators unsure whether they were approaching solid matter or an illusion. The question becomes immediate and unsettling. How do you recover something that behaves as if it belongs only half to this world? Though public reports never make the mechanisms explicit, classified summaries reviewed by journalists and insider claims describe phenomena at crash sites where time, space, and matter seemed inconsistent. Personnel have reported moments when pieces of hulls disappeared at the touch, or when equipment placed nearby returned contradictory readings. In some cases, what looked like stable plating rippled like heat haze, and in others watches worn by team members ticked out of sync with those waiting. Outside, these observations, echoed across separate accounts, give rise to the idea that not all crashes involve ordinary wreckage. Sometimes what falls here is only partially anchored to us. The risks of working in these conditions multiply quickly. Insiders describe personnel edging forward towards something that appeared solid, only to be pulled back when a portion of their outline flickered or felt distorted. One testimony recalled burns across skin where instruments had logged nothing unusual. Another described sudden vertigo, as if gravity had lurched sideways for a second. These events, fragmentary as they are, hint that an unstable field around certain craft can affect matter briefly, even living bodies. Training materials for those in recovery operations reportedly warn that such instability is no minor detail. It can be lethal. Emory Smith has recounted stepping inside a zone cordoned off by soldiers, where the craft at the center seemed impossible to categorize. From one angle, the surface appeared metallic. From another, it shimmered like molten glass, freezing and running in alternating patterns as if undecided about its own state. Touch produced the eerie sensation of sliding through something both solid and liquid at once. Instruments confirmed contact, yet the fingertips reported absence. Attempts to hold the reading too long sometimes caused equipment to overload or return corrupted data, as though the environment itself would not allow measurement to settle. Analysts familiar with these accounts have speculated that such vehicles may operate by phasing into dimensions outside our ordinary understanding, and that catastrophic failure leaves them only partially stabilized when forced into three-dimensional space. In practice, this would mean certain sections of the craft remain embedded wherever they had transited through, creating flickers or unpredictable interference. For those at the scene, the effect is unmistakable. The craft appears present, then absent, while distortions in light, sound, or time ripple through nearby space. Even if the theory remains speculative, the testimony consistently describes conditions where physics itself seems to stutter. These fragile states do not last indefinitely, but their collapse can be abrupt. Insiders tell of structures holding long enough for scans and cautious probes, then disintegrating suddenly when touched by drilling equipment. One report circulated of a chamber folding inward within seconds, collapsing as though drawn through itself while whole sections vanished from measurable space. Objects and devices within were lost completely. In retrospect, analysts propose that the act of drilling may have disrupted the delicate balance that held the craft partially stable. To teams in the field, all that mattered was that their chance to secure evidence ended in a flash. This forces a decision few want to make. Should a team attempt to stabilize a phased craft with specialized emitters, knowing that a failed attempt may bring collapse? Or withdraw, preserving lives but losing everything that might be learned? Certain insiders suggest portable resonance fields were sometimes deployed in hopes of anchoring fragments fully into three dimensions, with varying results. A few shards have been collected this way, but full success appears rare. More often, teams retreat with little more than traces, fragments, or records of inconsistent sensor data. Entire vessels, large enough to rewrite science if studied, have simply blinked away before they could be secured. When members of the public wonder why disclosure efforts sometimes produce little concrete material evidence, this possibility offers one explanation. Interdimensional events may ensure much is lost before any clean recovery becomes possible. But secrecy does not always equal failure, and testimonies remind us that redaction remains deliberate policy. Some silences, insiders suggest, reflect the impossibility of preserving evidence. Others reflect choices made to maintain national advantage by withholding details. Both realities may coexist: craft that no one could save, and craft where knowledge was saved but locked down. For the observer outside, silence masks both equally. The impact on those tasked with retrieval is profound. Teams have reported instruments losing calibration in unpredictable bursts, compasses flipping, and communications developing static that distorted speech. A step forward could feel normal until the ground softened like water underfoot, though no liquid was present. Probes sometimes vanished midair, and video captured figures flickering in and out of recorded frames. One witness noted that nothing in his training compared to watching his colleague's hand appear delayed, as though reality itself was stretched around them. Surviving such conditions was seen less as a triumph of skill than as sheer luck. Smith described moving close to a panel that emitted a low hum. To him, it felt like icy metal, yet his teammates swore it appeared as a curtain of light with no solid core. The contradiction could not be resolved even after reviewing the data. Later, playback from cameras revealed skips where frames dropped, producing flickers not attributable to equipment error. Encounters like these left participants troubled, not only by physical threats, but by the sense that their perception itself had been manipulated. Operational guidelines in such environments offer few comforting options. Portable stabilizers can occasionally create small windows of solidity, allowing brief collection of samples. But calibrating those fields requires trial and error, and too often the error causes sudden collapse. There are accounts of successful material recovery, but just as many of explosive destabilizations scattering volatile fragments. Supervisors must choose whether to risk additional lives for slight gains or cut losses and withdraw. Each choice leaves dissatisfaction, either dangerous sacrifice or permanent absence of data. Insiders have said that higher-level panels discussing these incidents acknowledge that substantial portions of potential technology may already be lost forever, simply gone in moments when unstable craft phased away. What remains are testimonies, half-complete sensor records, and strained attempts to explain phenomena outside verified physics. Public explanation falters partly because disclosing such failures would force leaders to admit limits in front of a skeptical public. It is easier, politically, to redact than to say, "We had it before us and it vanished." For field teams, the difficulty extends well beyond disappointment. Individuals speak of exiting zones that distorted time and then feeling unsettled for hours afterward, convinced clocks moved incorrectly, or struggling to trust their own memories. Discussions in decompression briefings often fail, because no words capture what it meant to hear your own heartbeat dragging unnaturally, or watching a colleague stutter like a skipped recording. Even if they walk out physically stable, those moments trail them. And this highlights the real cost of interdimensional encounters. They are measured not just by technology lost, but by the toll exacted on the people sent to retrieve it. Each anomaly leaves behind memories of a universe flexing beyond familiar rules, pressing humans to their limits of comprehension. Soldiers and scientists alike return carrying more than secrecy. They carry the imprint of instability, of something greater than their training. When a craft phases out from under your hand, the absence left behind is not only material, it is psychological. Teams come back shaken, their sense of reality marked by what they saw flicker and disappear. That human cost is what lingers longest. And it sets the stage for the next question, one that drifts beyond mechanics and secrecy. What weight do these encounters place on the individuals who are asked to witness them, and to live with the silence afterward? The silent weight on retrieval teams. The toll on those selected for crash retrieval missions is profound, and it rarely comes from radiation burns or unstable alloys. The deeper weight lies in what they are forced to carry quietly back into ordinary life. Veterans of these programs describe the most difficult burden not as technical danger, but as the unspoken intimacy of holding a life form that is neither animal nor human, and then being told they could never acknowledge it existed. The shock of these encounters is not in strange machines. It is in the silent contact with breathing forms that challenge every boundary of belief. Insiders consistently compare the psychological impact to battlefield trauma, but with an added dimension for which combat offers no precedent. Soldiers returning from war speak of enemies and comrades. Retrieval teams return with memories of beings whose smallest gestures blurred the edges of reality. They recall eyes with geometries unfamiliar to biology textbooks, or skin that seemed to radiate warmth without heat. One specialist said the most unsettling memory was not the crash site itself, but the rhythm of breathing he could not forget, because it never matched any mammal he had ever studied. The trauma is layered, danger in the moment, and collapse of certainty afterward. Accounts describe how structured routines were created to contain that collapse. Decompression exercises after missions began with control of voice and breath, guiding personnel back toward familiar perception. Reports say these sessions resembled meditation rather than interrogation, urging participants to divide their memories into compartments where the unshareable moments could be sealed away. Official terms like cognitive hygiene were used, but insiders understood the real purpose, training operatives to bury the most disruptive experiences before they returned to daily routines. This silence was not optional. Oaths backed by official orders made it clear that disclosure outside restricted rooms would bring immediate penalties. As a result, those most in need of psychological support could not reach out. Therapists were off limits. Family conversations stopped at vague generalities. Even casual talk with colleagues outside the program was dangerous. Witnesses said this left them isolated inside secrecy, carrying grief with no outlet and learning to mask it beneath layers of practiced composure. Some managed for years. Others fractured quickly. Certain accounts stand out. Emory Smith has reflected on the sudden closeness that forms in a handful of seconds when interacting with something alive yet unknown. For him, such encounters shook structures of belief, faith, hierarchy, identity, until nothing felt the same again. Even without verbal language, he described reciprocity in eye contact and small gestures. Losing one of these beings carried a different magnitude than losing a comrade in war, because grief reached beyond personal ties into the meaning of humanity itself. That distinction haunted him long after the mission ended. Not all stories remained sealed. In a few cases, follow-up reporting has hinted that institutions themselves acknowledge these strains. Journalists reviewing defense allocations noted references to resilience programs, crafted for classified personnel operating in non-standard environments. While details remain sealed, insiders point to this as an indirect recognition that those serving on crash retrieval teams require specialized psychological support. The wording is deliberately vague, but its appearance signals that the toll is no longer treated strictly as rumor. It is now considered a cost. Stories circulate quietly between veterans as warnings. One repeatedly cited example tells of an officer who dreamed each night of a being that had died in his arms during an operation. For months he tried to wall away the image, but the face returned, not just in sleep, but in waking reflections. Unable to dismiss the apparition, he requested to leave the program entirely. His resignation was accepted without protest, which fellow personnel read as tacit acknowledgement that withdrawal was sometimes the only way forward. Tales like his serve as reminders that not every participant returns intact. Others describe persistent health effects, both physical and mental. Jacob Barber, a Navy serviceman who testified publicly, spoke of long-term symptoms linked to close exposure during UAP events. His account adds weight to claims that crash retrieval teams endure not just psychological strain, but medical consequences as well. The research interests of people like Stanford professor Gary Nolan, who has studied anomalous injuries among personnel exposed to unknown technologies, further anchor these stories. The overlap suggests that the cost runs across body and mind, lasting long beyond deployment. Such realities transform the meaning of recovery missions. The public often imagines science as the gain, samples of alloys, fragments of machinery, data on unknown life. Insiders argue the parallel loss is human stability. Each piece of evidence carried out extracts something from the people involved. What advances knowledge simultaneously redefines those who witnessed it. The machines become cataloged artifacts, but the witnesses remain fractured in ways they cannot discuss. This duality is rarely admitted in hearings or official language, but among those who served, it is regarded as the truest measure of cost. The contradiction intensifies under the rules of secrecy. Ordinary grief finds relief in expression. Shared memory spreads its weight. For retrieval personnel, grief is locked under enforced silence, its presence denied to the public that demanded their service. Even within the institutions that oversaw them, recognition is partial at best. Resilience without open admission of the events that caused it. This leaves operatives caught between compassion demanded in the field and the absence of recognition when they return. That tension, insiders say, was often heavier than the missions themselves. Some managed this burden by building private coping rituals. Journals written in coded shorthand allowed them to place grief into words without directly breaking orders. Others relied on silent forms of meditation, rehearsing entire memories in their minds as if replaying them for someone who could never arrive. A few buried themselves deeper in analysis, hoping that turning everything into data would protect them from the emotional residue. None of these solutions erased the impact. They merely scattered it into fragments. Within the unacknowledged community of veterans, recognition still flows silently, in quick nods or glances that acknowledge the presence of the unspeakable. The fact that resilience initiatives appear, even in veiled public documents, confirms some weight of these reports. Programs that serve no purpose other than to stabilize minds after classified encounters with non-human intelligence imply survival of conditions beyond simple wreckage. And if resilience is required, the cause is real. This is the quiet admission embedded in bureaucratic language. Healing cannot be separated from encounter. Yet until leaders connect these dots openly, operatives remain the only witnesses to carry grief both personal and planetary. The narratives of trauma do more than expand the human story of retrieval. They create tension for the institutions that govern disclosure. Officials can release numbers, admit materials, and speak cautiously of anomalies. What they do not admit are the faces that veterans can no longer forget, or the grief that still shapes their sleep decades later. This silence is strategic, but it leaves individuals fractured in ways no budget line can repair. Insiders describe this contradiction as the most corrosive element of service. Machines are seen, measured, hidden. Their existence is acknowledged without fear. But the fragile lives tied to those machines, when seen, must be concealed completely, even as their memory shapes the witnesses forever. That is the silent weight, being forced to pretend nothing happened while knowing that what you saw cannot be erased. The public may one day hear more about alloys, propulsion, and physics, but until survivors of these missions are allowed a full voice, the deepest truth remains hidden behind silence. For now, only fragments reach the surface: scattered testimony, brief reporting, ambiguous budget phrases. And what remains unanswered is the most human question. If these teams return traumatized and barred from speaking, who speaks for the cost, scientists, leaders, or the public? Why governments admit numbers but not lives? Why do governments risk controversy by putting out limited data on UAP encounters but refuse to speak about anything alive? That choice is not accidental. It reflects carefully measured boundaries. Admitting retrieval numbers keeps the issue contained to hardware and statistics. Life, however, is something else. Once survival enters the record, it changes policy questions from possession of technology to recognition of beings with presence and rights. That shift explains why numbers are disclosed and lives remain hidden. The gap lies in what each admission implies. Wreckage can be presented as material for study: alloys, energy patterns, or unknown components. Even remains, if lifeless, can be handled as evidence, cataloged without granting legal status. Survival is different. If a being is living, then leaders confront questions human society has not prepared for. Do humans owe the entity the same medical protections extended to prisoners of war? Should it be safeguarded by humanitarian law? Would the United Nations have to establish protocols for its treatment? Experts who analyze policy warn that acknowledgement of survival would ignite debates about rights, sovereignty, and obligations that extend far beyond science. This tension was visible in public hearings during 2023, when whistleblowers like David Grush told Congress about programs allegedly hiding non-human biologics. Officials denied the claims, yet the exchange revealed how fragile the topic is. Even addressing dead bodies strained credibility and provoked defensive reactions from defense agencies. If the focus shifted to living beings, the pressure would intensify exponentially. Admitting survival would not just require defending a story, it could demand rewriting international frameworks. Governments maintain control over materials because metal and fragments do not demand recognition. They can be studied secretly, classified, even hidden outright. A being that breathes or stirs cannot be so easily contained. Its existence is not passive. A single photograph showing movement or a video capturing gestures would escape government narrative control instantly. Unlike alloys, a survivor provides its own confirmation. That loss of control explains why the strongest redactions and freedom of information releases consistently appear around terms such as biological stabilization or entity communication. Agencies allow readers to see numbers and vague details about craft, but words implying care or survival are blocked. Analysts who track declassified reports note the repetition. Phrases relating to entities in contact or attempts at stabilization are consistently blacked out, while references to alloys or debris remain. Independent researchers argue this pattern itself tells the story. What can be disclosed is limited to hardware, while anything touching on life is hidden. If no survival occurred at all, the objections would vanish. The redactions, by their persistence, suggest officials fear obligations triggered by such admissions. The stakes extend well beyond secrecy. A living being, if confirmed, would spark worldwide scrutiny. Where is it housed? Who is responsible for its care? Has communication occurred? Are agreements already made in secret? These questions would not be theoretical. They would come from legal scholars, faith leaders, humanitarian organizations, and publics across the globe. Silence avoids these pressures. It lets governments present themselves as cautious guardians releasing data about objects, while avoiding the explosive cascade of obligations that life would bring. Consider one example hinted at in Canadian committee documents in 2025. The question of whether living non-human recoveries, if real, should fall under Geneva protections. Such a query might sound academic, yet its implications are vast. Recognizing rights for a survivor would immediately demand compliance with humanitarian law. Denying them would expose governments to charges of unlawful captivity. The debate would not stay in parliaments. It would spill into courts, universities, newsrooms, and congregations. For national leaders, silence on life is less risky than the confrontation such issues would trigger. By publishing retrieval totals or UAP reports, powers set themselves up as open and forthcoming. This limited transparency calms public demand without opening the gates too wide. The narrative remains manageable: exotic metals, weird flight paths, unexplained sightings. But every discussion of consciousness or recovery of a living being is erased or redirected. For governments, this balance is not about lying outright, but about managing perception. They can acknowledge anomalies while keeping the question of survivors quarantined in secrecy. Experts studying government communication patterns call this layered disclosure. It is not absence of transparency, but selective openness designed to keep the narrative within defined limits. Numbers can be admitted, presence cannot. The outcome is a controlled dialogue where citizens debate statistics but never face the reality of survival. The deeper implication is left for silence to carry, with redactions highlighting what cannot be said. Political strategy supports the approach. Leaders know that metals can be grouped under defense research. Energy anomalies can fall under aerospace study. None of this demands global treaties. A living occupant does. It poses ethical challenges cutting across diplomatic, legal, and religious lines. Survival would not only change science, it would redefine geopolitics. Governments already cautious about revealing advanced technology have even greater incentive to avoid these existential debates. That caution is consistent with patterns seen since the 1940s. Officials routinely share limited findings, but withdraw from any detail that touches biology or consciousness. Recent hearings continue that precedent. Data about flight paths, sightings, and materials are delivered, but questions about life remain deflected. This is not accidental. It is the consequence of weighing costs too heavy for current institutions to carry. So why admit numbers at all? Because doing nothing invites suspicion, while controlled disclosure offers legitimacy. By confirming totals of incidents or retrievals, governments demonstrate they are listening and releasing data. This posture satisfies demand for transparency without destabilizing existing security frameworks. Citizens know something is happening, but they are guided to think only in terms of machines. The irony is that every omission strengthens speculation. With each redacted phrase or evasive response, the public begins to sketch the outline of what has been withheld. Experts and commentators argue that omission often functions as indirect acknowledgement. Not admitting life explicitly does not erase it. It suggests the subject is too politically volatile to print. In this way, silence itself becomes evidence. The withholding points directly to what is most sensitive. Not alloys, not propulsion systems, but possible survival. Debates about disclosure rarely escape the orbit of materials and mechanics. Yet with every redacted line, the suspicion of life grows stronger. And as witnesses like Emory Smith continue offering personal accounts, the gap between official numbers and unofficial stories grows sharper. Ultimately, the government's choice to admit crash totals while suppressing all mention of survivors reveals priorities. They weigh military advantage, scientific secrecy, and global diplomacy, and in that calculation, admitting survival comes at costs far greater than releasing data on debris. Analysts caution that once a live being is acknowledged, its treatment, rights, and cultural significance leap beyond the reach of classified programs. Learning to handle that step requires frameworks no nation currently has in place. For the public, the result is frustration, numbers without context, fragments without narrative. Yet inside that imbalance rests a clue. What is most feared is not the craft but the consciousness. While debris can be described in sterile terms, survival redefines the conversation as recognition and engagement. And that is what governments most want to delay. If political caution explains the silence, another perspective reveals the missing dimension: the people who were there. For insiders, the issue is not theory but memory, moments where silence could not erase what they saw. And among the clearest accounts is Emory Smith's testimony, where routine procedure gave way to a decision that no manual could guide. It began in silence, the kind that always settles once a site is secured, and what followed would reshape everything his team thought they knew. The moment that changed everything for Emory Smith. According to Emory Smith, there was one recovery that redefined everything he thought he understood. His team expected routine work: scan the debris, measure for hazards, identify fragments, and proceed with biological checks only if lifeless remains were found. That was the rhythm of countless operations. But in this case, Smith recalled approaching a section of wreckage and noticing what looked like a crumpled shape beside it. At first it seemed like another body to be logged, until, as he tells it, the eyes opened. In his account, that single movement changed the air around them. The team froze. Their training demanded detachment, but nothing in their preparation accounted for a conscious being staring back. Smith said the gaze was weak yet direct, the chest rising and falling in shallow, deliberate breaths. In those seconds, every principle drilled into them collided. Contain, observe, record. But here was something alive, watching them. Any decision could change its outcome. Approach too quickly, it might panic or collapse. Pull back, and they might abandon its fading life. Smith often described it as a moral standoff carried in silence. He remembered how procedure suddenly felt brittle. The monitors around them still caught faint energy from the craft, surfaces pulsing unevenly as though linked to its condition. Each time its eyes flicked, subtle lights rearranged themselves across twisted panels. To Smith, it seemed less like residual mechanics and more like the vessel and occupant remained bound together, a circuit of being and machine. That realization heightened every hesitation. It was not simply about removing a body. Intervening at all could ripple through the entire scene. According to his telling, the debate played out in gestures and whispers. A soldier questioned whether even getting too close might harm the being. A medic, torn between instinct and restraint, argued that leaving it unaided would guarantee failure. Smith admitted the fear contorted everyone in different ways. Fear of worsening its condition. Fear of letting it die. Fear that their own emotions might somehow feed back into the wreck still humming faintly around them. Each possibility felt unbearable. What Smith emphasizes most is that presence mattered more than instruments. He described how they moved slowly, deliberately lowering themselves toward its level, choosing quiet steadiness over procedure. A gloved hand reached out without touching, signaling nothing but calm intent. For him, this was the decisive moment, the shift from recovery operation to recognition of another living participant. He believed they saw the being's breathing change, not healed, but steadier, less erratic. It seemed to respond not to their science or tools, but to the absence of threat. Smith later reflected that compassion became the only form of medicine they could offer. He insisted they did not understand its organs, its systems, or how to treat trauma beyond human knowledge. Yet what they gave, measured breathing, calm presence, a refusal to panic, extended its awareness for precious additional moments. According to him, even the craft reflected this stabilization, its panels holding light more steadily than before. He carried away the conviction that empathy could function as a lifeline, even when no physical intervention was possible. This account carries its own contradiction. Everything in their orders stressed collection and secrecy. They were supposed to behave as forensic teams, measuring and controlling, not comforting. But Smith said the reality of contact made the scientific posture collapse. Facing an injured non-human being forced them into choices they had not rehearsed. He admitted that the gaze of another intelligence demanded acknowledgement. For him, recognition outweighed catalog data. That realization cut deeper than the technology surrounding them. From Smith's perspective, this was the memory that redefined disclosure. He argued that extraterrestrials are not always casualties to be boxed and stored. Sometimes they survive long enough for moral choices to matter. Sometimes teams are placed not in roles of containment, but of caregivers, even briefly. And those moments reveal outcomes that do not appear in files, because compassion and connection cannot be redacted into numbers. They remain only in testimony. According to Smith, governments never record these human dimensions. Official reports highlight materials, incidents, and sightings, but never describe an injured being's eyes opening, or its breath matching the hush of a team trying to stabilize fear. That silence is deliberate. He believed that if compassion were admitted as part of recovery, the entire framework of secrecy would collapse. Citizens would demand to know why we treated survivors this way, why moral choices were hidden under statistics. For Smith, that was precisely why those memories lingered privately, passed only in testimony. He often said that his career divided cleanly in that instant, before meant order, catalogs, implements. After meant recognition that once consciousness looked back, evidence was no longer inert. From then on, every number mentioned in hearings seemed insufficient to him, because behind each line might be a moment where empathy guided the outcome. That was the difference he carried home. The understanding that disclosure is less about data and more about life witnessed firsthand. According to Smith, those who were there brought back not just samples or fragments, but memories incapable of being filed away. He and others repeated quietly that survivors, however briefly present, proved contact had already occurred. Not in the treaties or committees that leaders reference, but at eye level, under conditions too intimate to ignore. The testimony, once spoken, becomes more than recollection. It is a challenge to the public version of events. Whistleblower testimony in public hearings in recent years suggest that Smith's moment was not isolated. Others have hinted, sometimes indirectly, at confrontations with life that strain their sense of duty. These shared fragments align on one point. The deepest disclosures are not about alloys or propulsion. They are buried in the choices teams made under pressure, deciding between following orders or answering the human instinct to comfort. For Smith, that haunting choice stayed long after the crash was sealed. He said evidence can be erased, objects can be hidden, but those minutes watching a being struggle for life sit outside secrecy. No mandate can remove their weight. The story is personal because it is also irreducibly human. Even in silence, it defines the meaning of what he called true disclosure. And it leaves behind a question larger than any piece of wreckage. If teams have already stood before survivors, if compassion has already been tested against protocol, then disclosure is not about fragments at all. It is about redefining what life itself means, and where humanity chooses to stand when faced with another consciousness. That unresolved question is what Smith believes governments cannot hold back indefinitely. His account underscores how disclosure cannot stop at numbers. It must eventually confront the reality of life witnessed and the choices made in its presence. The debate is no longer technical, it is moral. And that moral frontier is what comes next. Disclosure is about more than salvage. It ultimately raises questions about life and responsibility. Machines and fragments can be hidden, but the choice to acknowledge another living presence cannot be erased. Numbers, redactions, and testimony line up to make one plain point. The technical puzzle is only half the story. What matters next is how we choose to respond. Experts warn that admitting survivors would demand urgent international debate, a challenge governments avoid through silence. But how long can secrecy hold when lives and first contact moments exist? Share in the comments how you would face that decision, and subscribe for more balanced investigations.